She didn't run when they buried him. She simply sat there, watching the church doors that would never open again. The German shepherd by the name of Shadow didn't cry, didn't move, didn't blink, only waited, as if guarding an invisible thread. The world around him moved on. Cars leaving, doors closing, voices fading, but his mission had just begun. Abandoned by those who never knew his true purpose, Shadow leapt into the unknown, carrying a silent promise he could never forget. He didn't search for food, shelter, or comfort. He searched for broken souls, carrying the unfinished kindness of a man now gone. And as his paws touched the dusted roads of forgotten towns, each stop whispered, "We've been waiting for you." Dolores couldn't yet know that the dog waiting by her gate carried a path back to her son. Margaret had no idea that relighting her old lantern would finally silence the years of crippling fear. Carlos certainly could not realize that opening his arms to Mateo would restore the family he feared was lost forever. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy heartfelt tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come. Now let's begin. It all started with the kind of silence that sits heavy on a house long after the funeral guests have quietly driven away. The Montana sky stretched wide that morning, not with the bright hope of a new day, but with a soft, muted gray that made the air feel older than it should have been. Harold Brooks had been buried under that same sky only hours earlier, a man who had spent his life teaching, not with loud speeches or harsh words, but with the simple steadiness of kindness that made people better just by knowing him. The neighbors had gathered at the white wooden church on the hill, heads bowed, not out of formality, but because they each carried some small piece of Harold's quiet generosity inside them. Now that he was gone, the world felt thinner somehow, as if the ground itself no longer had quite the same strength beneath people's feet. In the back of the church lot, sitting alone in the flatbed of Harold's old truck, was the last living creature who had known his every sunrise and every long, silent evening. The German shepherd's coat was graying around the face, his chest broad, his breathing steady but slow, like a clock that knew its gears were wearing thin. His name was Shadow. And though the voices around him faded, and the doors of the chapel creaked open and shut, Shadow never looked away from that church door, waiting for his master to walk out one last time. When the service ended, Harold's niece, Paula, who had driven in from Spokane, approached the truck, her voice already tight from the errands of closing another man's life. "I don't know what to do with this dog," she muttered into her phone, her eyes darting everywhere, but toward Shadow. "I'll drop him at a shelter before I leave town." The truck rolled down the gravel road, Shadow standing steady in the back, staring forward, his ears twitching but his eyes strangely calm, like a creature not afraid, but waiting. 2 hours later, they arrived at a small roadside shelter. Nothing more than a collection of chain-link fences and tired volunteers who already had too many mouths to feed. Before Paula could open the tailgate, Shadow moved with a grace that surprised even his old bones, leaping from the truck and disappearing into the wide fields beyond, carried by a memory stronger than any leash. He ran not wild, but with a strange purpose, his legs remembering a path that his mind may no longer have fully understood, yet his heart insisted upon. By the time Paula hit the brakes, calling out after him in frustration, Shadow had become little more than a gray figure melting into the open plains. He was not lost. He was beginning. The sun dipped low that evening as Shadow walked, steady and sure, the endless road stretching before him like an old, familiar him he had never quite forgotten. 3 days later, his feet carried him into a town so small it barely made a mark on most maps, a place called Minden, North Dakota, where the population sign read 304, though no one had bothered to update it in years. There, beneath the flickering lantern of a worn front porch, sat an elderly woman wrapped in an old shawl, her thin hands folding and unfolding the fabric in a rhythm only she understood. Her name was Dolores. She watched the shepherd approach, not with fear, but with the cautious curiosity of someone who knows when fate is knocking softly at her door. The dog stopped at the gate and lay down, breathing slow, eyes never leaving hers, as though offering no explanation, only presence. Dolores leaned forward, her voice just a whisper against the quiet. "What are you looking for?" Old friend. I guess. You're looking for me, Dolores whispered into the morning air, as though answering the very question her heart had asked the night before. The soft light of dawn slid carefully through the crooked wooden slats of her porch, casting long, gentle shadows that seemed to stretch like reaching fingers toward the old shepherd resting just beyond her gate. For 30 years, Dolores had lit that porch lantern every single night, not because she needed the light herself, but because hope is sometimes too stubborn to surrender. Her son, Henry Jr., had disappeared into a war zone on the far side of the world, gone without a trace, without a body, without even the cruel mercy of certainty. The government called it missing in action, but those words were only a tidy label for the kind of pain that can't fit inside any telegram or official report. Every evening since, as the sun dipped behind the endless fields, she lit that lantern like a beacon for a ship she no longer believed would return but could never stop waiting for. Neighbors had stopped asking about him years ago, their polite curiosity slowly replaced by uneasy silence and quiet pity as the seasons rolled past her front door like drifting leaves. The house had grown heavy with memories that had no place to go, photographs yellowed beneath layers of dust, unopened drawers filled with letters she never dared read again. And yet now, out of all the years of waiting, this dog, this aging German shepherd, had arrived like a quiet echo of something unfinished. Dolores stood, her fingers clutching the edge of the wooden rocking chair, steadying herself as she made her way toward the front gate, which creaked softly beneath her touch. The shepherd watched her carefully, not rising, not retreating, but allowing her nearness as though this meeting had long been agreed upon by forces neither of them could name. "You look like you traveled a long way," she said, her voice soft, each word feeling like it had to cross a great distance inside her to find its way out. She reached down, her hand hovering just above his thick fur, and when her fingertips finally brushed against his coat, a warmth passed between them that surprised her aching chest. The lantern beside them flickered slightly in the breeze, but its flame held steady, as though it too understood that something important had quietly begun here. For 3 days, Shadow remained beside Dolores' porch, neither demanding food nor making a sound beyond his slow, even breaths that rose and fell like waves upon a calm shoreline. During those days, Dolores found herself speaking aloud for the first time in years, not to neighbors, not to doctors, but to him, as though the dog's stillness created space for her voice to live again. She told him about Henry Jr., about his stubbornness, about his crooked smile, about the guitar he never fully learned to play but carried everywhere nonetheless. She spoke of the night the letter arrived, of the days that followed, of the years spent pretending that maybe tomorrow the phone might ring with his voice on the other end. Shadow listened, not with words, not with nods, but with that steady gaze that seemed to carry no judgment, only understanding. Then, on the 4th morning, as Dolores fetched some kindling from the old shed behind her house, her foot caught on a loose board beneath the tool rack. The board shifted beneath her weight, revealing a hollow she had long forgotten, or perhaps had chosen to forget, as people sometimes do when grief needs hiding places. Kneeling carefully, her fingers trembling, she reached into the space and pulled out a weathered metal box wrapped in brittle canvas that crumbled slightly beneath her touch. Inside the box lay old military medals, photographs she hadn't seen in decades, and a bundle of letters written in her son's hand that had never been mailed. On top of them, resting like a final whisper, was Henry Jr.'s worn dog tag, its numbers still visible though the metal was dulled by time and dust. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched the tag tightly, her breath shuddering under the weight of all the years she had carried without release. The shepherd stood in the doorway of the shed, his head slightly tilted, as if gently encouraging her to let the tears fall freely now, with no shame, no fear. Dolores whispered into the quiet, her voice cracking under the tenderness of the moment. "How did you know this was still here?" "I didn't know," George said softly to himself, though his words felt as though they carried across miles, answering a question he never actually heard. He sat alone in the dim light of his small clock repair shop in Iowa, where the steady ticking of dozens of clocks filled the air like breathing walls that had never known true silence. The old shop smelled of wood oil, brass polish, and the faint scent of rain that had passed through earlier that morning, leaving streaks along the windows like fingerprints from the sky itself. George Parker, now 78 years old, had once believed in the comfort of fixing what was broken, tiny gears, delicate springs, fragile hands pointing faithfully toward measured time. For nearly 5 decades, his hands had steadied the heartbeat of countless families' heirlooms, each clock carrying inside it not only minutes and hours, but entire lives wrapped around its steady pulse. But ever since his wife Ruth passed 5 years ago, the clocks seemed less like loyal companions and more like stubborn reminders of everything he could no longer repair. He had slowly stopped taking new work, his tools growing dusty, his shop becoming more a museum of yesterday than a place where time was actively tended and trusted. Each morning, he unlocked the door out of habit, not hope, sitting behind his workbench simply because he could not bear the emptiness waiting for him inside his home. And then, one morning, the dog appeared. The rain had left puddles along the sidewalk, and yet the German Shepherd lay dry beneath the overhang, his coat thick but weathered, his eyes watching George through the front window with unsettling calm. George stood for several minutes, staring back through the glass, trying to decide whether to open the door or simply pretend he hadn't noticed. In the end, it was the stillness of the dog's gaze that pulled him forward, the kind of gaze that made a man feel seen in ways no words could quite match. The old brass bell above the shop door jingled softly as George stepped outside into the damp air, his shoes scraping gently across the concrete. "You're not here by accident, are you?" George asked quietly, his voice dry from disuse but steady, like the hands of a well-built clock still ticking despite age. The dog offered no answer, only blinking once as his tail gave a slow, deliberate thump against the sidewalk. George left the door cracked open, returning inside, but the shepherd remained nearby, content to rest by the entrance, as though guarding something precious inside rather than asking for anything himself. For 3 days, their rhythm remained unchanged, George working silently behind his bench while the dog watched from his corner beneath the window. And then, on the 4th day, something curious happened. The large grandfather clock against the back wall, Ruth's favorite, suddenly stirred to life, its pendulum swaying with a gentle click, though George hadn't touched its dusty mechanism in over 2 years. Startled, George rose and examined the clock closely, but found no evidence of tampering or spontaneous repair, only the quiet, faithful ticking that now filled the room again. That same afternoon, the bell above the door jingled for the first time in months. A little girl, Sophie, no more than 7, stood in the doorway holding a small velvet pouch, her eyes wide with the tentative hope only children can carry. "My grandma said you used to fix things," she said shyly, her voice barely above a whisper as she held the pouch forward with both trembling hands. Inside was a delicate wristwatch, its face cracked, its hands frozen in place, an anniversary gift from Sophie's grandfather many years earlier, long broken and long forgotten. George stared at it for a long moment, his hands hovering above the fragile object as if unsure whether his fingers still remembered how to mend what was broken. The dog, still lying at his usual post beneath the window, lifted his head slightly, meeting George's eyes with quiet patience, as if offering silent encouragement. Taking a deep breath, George picked up his tools and slowly began to work, his fingers finding their rhythm as though they had only been waiting for permission. By sunset, the watch ticked once more, its hands sweeping gracefully across the tiny dial as Sophie smiled with wide, tearful eyes. Her grandmother returned the next day, and soon word spread through the town like a slow, warm breeze, carrying with it whispers that George Parker was fixing clocks again. Day after day, old faces returned, carrying broken pieces of family history, while the little shop filled once more with voices, laughter, and the careful clatter of gears sliding back into place. The dog remained throughout it all, ever steady, ever silent, always watching, always present, like a quiet guardian of second chances. One evening, as George locked up and turned off the lights, he paused by the door, looking down at his four-legged visitor who now felt like family. With a voice soft as the night air, he whispered, "Why did you choose me, old boy?" "Because you were ready to be found again," Lester answered softly, though the only ears that truly heard him belonged to the wind crossing the old bridge. The Cotton Ridge Bridge stretched wide across the slow, brown river beneath it, standing like a tired spine that had carried the weight of cars, footsteps, and quiet regrets for decades. Lester Hill, 75 years old, had walked this bridge nearly every night for the past 30 years, not because he needed to, but because some roads are easier to walk than to leave behind. Once, long ago, this bridge had been part of his daily work as a state bridge inspector, his boots tapping across planks and beams as he checked bolts and cables with steady hands. But one night changed everything. A storm had rolled in quickly, turning the river below into a twisting, angry snake while the wind howled across the beams like some great beast warning them away. Lester had been walking with his younger brother Calvin that night, teaching him the ropes of inspection, showing him the careful dance between caution and confidence that every bridge man must learn. But when Calvin slipped, the screen was lost to the storm, and in an instant, he was gone, swallowed by the river, his harness snapping like a twig beneath him. The body was never found. Only the silence remained, following Lester home and wrapping itself around him like a heavy, wet coat that never fully dried. Now, every evening, Lester returned to the bridge, counting each board beneath his boots, speaking softly to a brother who never answered, but the habit kept his chest from caving in completely. And then, not long ago, the dog appeared. The German shepherd stood at the far end of the bridge one evening, waiting, his dark eyes reflecting the fading orange glow of sunset. At first, Lester thought he belonged to one of the nearby farms, but when the dog appeared again the next evening, and then the next, Lester began speaking to him as if they'd known each other far longer. "You're a good listener," Lester chuckled one night, his voice dry but grateful. "You don't argue. Don't rush me. I appreciate that." The dog made no sound, only sat calmly as Lester paced his way back and forth, reciting the same careful steps he had traced for so many years. On the seventh night, the wind blew stronger than usual, rattling the old bridge's joints as Lester walked slowly toward the place where Calvin had once slipped into the dark. The shepherd moved suddenly, padding toward a pile of twisted debris lodged between two beams near the edge where the planks had warped. With surprising care, the dog pawed at the tangle until something small and metallic glinted under the moonlight. Lester's heart hammered as he stepped closer, bending slowly to pick up the object with trembling hands. It was a rusted keychain, its once shiny metal dulled by years of rain and river mud, but still bearing the faint engraving, "C. Hill." The breath left Lester's lungs in a stuttering gasp, his knees nearly buckling beneath him as the memories surged forward like floodwaters no dam could stop. "I never came back for you, brother," he whispered, tears mixing with the night air. "I didn't know how." The dog sat beside him now, close but not pressing, offering presence without pity, like someone who knew grief needed space to breathe freely. For the first time since that stormy night, Lester spoke aloud not just to Calvin's ghost, but to the part of himself he had kept locked away for 3 decades. "I'm sorry it took me this long." The river below moved gently now, its surface calm, as though even the water had waited for these words. The shepherd lay down at Lester's feet, resting his head on his paws, eyes closed in patient approval. And as Lester stood once more, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve, he whispered toward the stars. "How did you know where to find him?" "I didn't," Allison murmured quietly, almost as though confessing her own surprise to the wind drifting lazily across the river behind her cabin. The water moved with its slow, steady rhythm, carrying fallen leaves downstream like forgotten stories floating toward places where no one waited to receive them. Allison Monroe, 69 years old, stood barefoot on her wooden porch, her hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug that had seen more sunrises than visitors these past few years. The cabin had once been her sanctuary, a place of simple beauty where she had come to write, to think, and to pull away from the world when her first 3 novels had made her name known. But after the accident, after she lost her grandson to the sudden, unforgiving pull of a flash flood, words had abandoned her, as though the river had stolen her voice along with him. The manuscript for her 4th book had gathered dust for years, resting unfinished in a drawer she rarely opened, its half-written pages holding more pain than prose. People stopped calling eventually, unsure of how to comfort a woman who didn't want to be comforted, who only wanted the world to forget she had once belonged to it. And then, one morning not unlike so many others, the dog came. He stood at the edge of the clearing as though he had stepped out of the trees themselves, blending into the mist that hovered low along the banks of the river. The German shepherd didn't bark, didn't approach with the clumsy excitement of most strays. Instead, he simply stood there, steady, his gaze calm and patient. For several minutes, Allison stared back, uncertain whether she was witnessing reality or simply one of the daydreams that had begun visiting her on long, silent afternoons. Finally, she spoke softly, as though speaking too loudly might cause him to vanish like a mirage. "You looking for someone, old boy?" The shepherd only blinked, his tail giving one slow wag, as though answering in his own way. "I found who I came for." From that day forward, the dog made her porch his home, never crossing the threshold uninvited, but never straying far either, as though keeping silent watch over her grief. During the long, empty days, Allison found herself talking again, first in short phrases, then in full conversations, as if the dog's presence gave her permission to speak aloud what she had kept locked inside. She spoke of her grandson, of his laughter, of the way his tiny hand used to slip into hers when they walked along the riverbanks looking for stones. She spoke of the guilt that weighed heavier than sorrow, the guilt of not being able to save him, of not writing him into the world in the only way she knew how, with her words. And all the while, the dog simply listened, his breathing soft, his eyes never leaving her face, never interrupting, never judging. Then, one afternoon, as the golden light slanted through the tall trees, Allison went to gather firewood from the shed behind the cabin, a place she hadn't entered in years. Her foot caught on a warped board, sending her stumbling forward. As she steadied herself, she noticed the loose floorboard slightly lifted, revealing a gap beneath. Inside the hidden space, wrapped in old fabric, lay her abandoned manuscript, brittle pages filled with half-finished chapters she had once written and later tried to forget. Tears welled in her eyes as she carefully unfolded the papers, the ink still clear, the words still waiting, like a voice paused mid-sentence. She sank to her knees, overcome not by grief this time, but by the overwhelming sense that perhaps the story wasn't finished after all. The shepherd appeared beside her in the open shed door, sitting quietly, his head slightly tilted, his steady gaze encouraging but unspoken. "How did you know these were still here?" she whispered through trembling lips. The dog said nothing, of course, but remained close as Allison carried the fragile stack of pages inside and gently laid them upon her writing desk. That night, for the first time in years, she lit her old oil lamp and picked up her pen, her hand trembling but determined. The words returned, slow at first, then steady, like water breaking through a dam. Weeks later, the manuscript was complete. The publisher received it with quiet astonishment. The reviews spoke of its raw honesty and the grace it carried through its sorrow. But none of it mattered as much to Allison as the single letter that arrived one cool autumn morning. It was from her granddaughter, whom she hadn't seen in almost a decade. The letter was simple, but inside its few lines lived everything Allison had longed to hear. "Grandma, I'd like to see you again, if you're ready." As she read those words again and again, her tears fell not from pain, but from the beautiful ache of hope returning. The dog lay at her feet, eyes half closed, as though content in his quiet witness of something set right. Softly, as she stroked the thick fur along his neck, Allison whispered, "Why did you come when you did, old friend?" "Because that's when you needed me," Frank said quietly, though no one stood nearby to hear him except the evening wind slipping across the empty ballfield. The sun hung low over the Oklahoma horizon, painting the rusted bleachers in deep amber, as though trying to give a little warmth back to a place that had been empty for far too long. Frank Delaney, 72 years old, sat on the creaking top bench of the old baseball field where entire summers of his life once bloomed and faded like cornfields swaying beyond the outfield fence. For more than 3 decades, he had coached the local kids here, teaching them not only how to catch fly balls and red pitches, but how to lose with dignity and win with humility. His own son, Adam, had grown up on this same field, chasing foul balls along the chalk lines, laughing in the golden light, learning to love the game because his father loved it first. But the school bus crash took all of that away on a rainy March morning, leaving nothing but headlines and a row of small white crosses beside the road that still made Frank's hands tremble when he drove past. He hadn't stepped on this field in years, not because the grass had grown wild or because the dugouts had rotted, but because the memories waited here, patient and unrelenting. Every night since, Frank had come to sit, not to play or coach, but simply to sit, as though paying some long debt to the past with his silence. And then, one evening as the warm breeze softened, the dog appeared. The German shepherd stood just beyond the third base line, his posture steady, his gaze fixed on Frank with a calmness that felt too intentional to dismiss as chance. At first, Frank said nothing, only lowering his cap against the setting sun as though shielding himself from a memory that hadn't fully arrived yet. But the dog returned the next evening, and the one after that, always finding his place beneath the bleachers as if reserving his spot in a silent congregation of 2. After several days, Frank finally spoke, his voice gravelly from years of disuse but still carrying that coach's quiet authority. "You don't have to keep watch on me, you know? I'm used to being alone out here." The dog didn't move, didn't bark, he only blinked slowly, as if reminding Frank that he was neither a burden nor a guest. Then, one evening, the dog rose and padded softly toward the far corner of the overgrown outfield, nosing through tall weeds that had swallowed the field's edges long ago. There, beneath layers of grass and dirt, the shepherd uncovered something with surprising care, a worn, weather-beaten baseball, its stitching loose, its leather cracked from seasons forgotten. The dog carried the ball in his mouth, walking slowly back to Frank, and laid it gently at his feet, resting his head upon his paws. Frank stared at the ball for a long time, his breath hitching, his fingers reaching down as though touching an old friend's hand. It was Adam's ball, one of many they had tossed back and forth in this very field, in a time when life was lighter and laughter lived easily in their lungs. Something inside Frank loosened then, something that had been clenching tight around his chest for too many years. The next evening, Frank didn't bring his usual thermos of coffee to the field. Instead, he carried an old canvas bag filled with balls, bats, and gloves, his hands trembling but eager. He stood at home plate for the first time in years, tossing a ball lightly into the air, feeling the weight of it settle into his palm like a memory made real again. Not long after, kids from nearby neighborhoods began to gather, some on bicycles, some walking, drawn by the strange sight of the old coach standing alone on the mound. Frank began to teach again, his voice finding its old rhythm, his feet rediscovering the familiar choreography of guiding small hands and positioning young shoulders. The field breathed again, and so did Frank. And every evening, as the children's laughter echoed beneath the wide Oklahoma sky, the German shepherd lay beneath the bleachers, watching with quiet satisfaction, his presence steady as ever. One night, as the last of the boys rode off into the dusk and Frank gathered the loose balls into his weathered bag, he looked toward his four-legged companion and whispered softly, "How did you know this was where I left everything behind?" "Because you didn't leave it behind," Margaret answered gently, though her voice barely carried beyond the thin walls of her small, dimly lit room. The old woman sat quietly beneath a knitted quilt, her thin hands resting on her lap, fingers gently tracing the fabric as though counting every fragile thread one by one. Outside her window, the coastal wind hummed low against the building, rattling the frame just enough to remind her of the sea that once ruled her every hour. Margaret Whitaker, 85 years old, had once stood watch over an entire coastline, her back straight and her eyes sharp as the beams she controlled swept through endless dark waters. For nearly 40 years, she had kept the lighthouse burning not as a job, but as a calling, guiding lost ships away from unseen rocks that could tear hulls open like thin paper. But when her legs grew weak, and her heart faltered with a quiet stroke one rainy autumn morning, they told her it was time to let someone else tend the light. Her lighthouse was automated now, operated by distant hands she never met, and she was placed gently in this care home far from the sound of crashing waves. But it wasn't the loss of work or purpose that haunted Margaret most, it was the dark. Every evening, as the staff dimmed the hall lights and shut the doors, the darkness would creep into her room like rising water, pressing against her chest with a quiet terror. The night was no longer something she controlled, it was something she feared. And then, as if carried in by the sea breeze itself, the dog appeared. No one saw how he arrived, no one questioned where he came from. The German shepherd simply lay outside her patio door, his broad body resting like a stone placed carefully at the edge of her world. The nurses whispered in the hallway, unsure whether to call animal control or let him stay, but Margaret asked them kindly, softly, to leave the door cracked open. Each night, while her pulse quickened beneath the heavy blanket of darkness, she would glance toward the glass where two calm eyes met hers, not demanding, not questioning, simply staying. For several nights, that was enough. Then came the storm. The wind howled through the trees like an old sailor's moan, and the rain struck the windows in sharp bursts that echoed like soft knocks against her fear. At 9:17 p.m., the power failed completely, plunging the entire building into thick, absolute blackness that swallowed even the emergency nightlights. Her breath caught in her throat as panic surged through her chest, her hand fumbling across the nightstand in search of the small flashlight she kept nearby. But her weakened hand knocked it to the floor, and the dark closed in fast and merciless, just as it had so many nights in her mind before. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered to no one, "Not like this. Please, not like this." Then she heard it, the soft padding of paws across her floor. The shepherd had slipped quietly through the patio door the staff had forgotten to secure, moving through the room with calm, steady purpose. In his jaws, he carried something unexpected, a small brass lantern, her old lighthouse lamp, long thought lost or discarded during her move into the care home. The dog placed it gently at the foot of her bed and sat beside her as though standing watch once more. Her trembling fingers traced the smooth brass, memories of nights spent high in the tower sweeping back like waves against the shore of her mind. With shaking hands, she lit the lantern. Its warm, golden glow filled the room, soft and steady, pushing back the dark without violence, but with calm authority, just like the beam she had once controlled so many years before. The storm raged outside, but inside the small room, there was only peace, her breathing slowing, her heartbeat finding its rhythm once more beneath the lantern's steady glow. As sleep pulled her gently under, she whispered toward the shepherd's still, patient form. "How did you know I couldn't face the dark alone?" "Because sometimes the dark isn't outside," Carlos answered quietly, staring out across the dry New Mexico hills where the evening sun bled into the cracked earth. The light faded behind him, casting long shadows across the small porch where he sat, his back curved, his hands resting heavily on his knees like anchors holding him to the world. Carlos Ramirez, 79 years old, had fought in one war and lost his son in another, yet it was neither battlefield that left him most wounded, it was what came after. When he returned from Korea, he brought home medals pinned to his chest and ghosts stitched quietly into his chest where no one could see. He had built a life despite them, raising his only son, Daniel, to be a stronger, braver man than he ever believed himself to be. And when Daniel answered his own call of duty, deploying to Afghanistan with pride and purpose, Carlos watched him leave with equal parts pride and dread curling deep inside his stomach. But Daniel never came home. The official words came wrapped in ceremony and silence, killed in action. No father should outlive his son, but Carlos carried that weight, growing more silent with each passing year, retreating from the world, shutting the door on the people who once tried to reach him. His daughter-in-law, Elena, and grandson, Mateo, tried visiting at first, bringing light and warmth with them, but Carlos couldn't bear to see Daniel's eyes living inside the boy. "I can't," he had whispered to Elena once, voice trembling. "I just can't face what I've lost every time I see him." So the years passed like dust carried by desert winds, silent, endless, and hollow. And then one morning, the dog appeared. The German shepherd came from across the horizon, walking slowly but without hesitation, his large frame steady against the dry wind that cut across the empty landscape. At first, Carlos thought he might belong to one of the neighboring ranchers, but when the dog settled on the porch and remained, something inside Carlos stirred. The dog didn't beg for food or attention. He simply stayed, breathing slow and steady, his eyes holding something too knowing to be chance. Each day, Carlos found himself speaking small words at first, then stories that had long gone unsaid, as though the dog's silence drew the weight out of him like water pulled from a dry well. Then, one afternoon, the shepherd rose and padded toward the old storage shed behind the house, a building Carlos hadn't entered since Daniel's funeral. The door creaked as the dog nosed it open, stepping carefully inside, while Carlos followed at a distance, his breath shallow, his chest tightening. Inside, stacked beneath old fishing rods and rusted toolboxes, sat a forgotten box, one he thought he had thrown away but must have hidden instead. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written by Elena in the first year after Daniel's death, letters Carlos had never opened. There were photographs, too, of Mateo as a baby, then as a toddler, learning to walk, learning to smile, a boy growing in snapshots Carlos had been too afraid to see. The weight of those lost years hit him like a wave, staggering him backwards, his hand gripping the edge of an old workbench to steady his knees. The dog sat quietly, watching, offering no judgment, only presence, as though waiting for Carlos to finally breathe again beneath the rubble of his own sorrow. That evening, Carlos made a call his hands had trembled to make for nearly 7 years. Elena answered with a voice cautious at first, but quickly filled with quiet relief as the conversation unfolded like a long-overdue sunrise. Days later, Elena and Mateo arrived at the house. The boy stood shyly at first, his small hand gripping his mother's, his wide eyes studying the old man who had once refused him. Carlos knelt slowly, his joints aching, but his heart moving easily now. He opened his arms. Mateo stepped forward. The hug they shared carried the weight of years, but not of blame, only of reunion. That night, after the house grew still and Elena and Mateo slept in the guest room for the first time, Carlos sat beside the shepherd on the porch. The stars blinked gently above them as Carlos whispered into the night. "How did you know my family was still waiting for me?" "Because they never stopped waiting," David answered softly, his voice barely louder than the gentle creak of the barn door as it swung in the evening breeze. The Arizona sky stretched wide above him, streaked with the last fading traces of pink and orange as night gently laid its hand over the desert. The barn stood quietly behind him, weathered by years of sun and wind, its red paint long faded to soft gray, like a memory worn smooth by time. David Walker, along with his wife Laura, had driven nearly 1,500 miles to this place, hoping to start fresh after years of waiting, paperwork, and heartbreak that had nearly broken them both. For years, they had tried to build a family, first with hope, then with medicine, and finally with prayers whispered in the quiet corners of rooms where doctors spoke softly and gently shook their heads. In the end, it wasn't biology that brought them their child. It was foster care, complicated, uncertain, often cruel, but through it came Jake, a boy who carried his own long road of wounds. Jake was 7 when they first held him, small for his age, his eyes wide and silent, his trust hidden deep behind walls built higher than any child should have to raise. The caseworkers warned them gently, speaking of trauma, of patience, of how some wounds might never fully close no matter how much love was poured into them. Still, they took him home, first to the city, then here, to this old ranch where David hoped the wide skies and simple rhythms might offer some kind of peace that crowded streets never could. But Jake spoke very little. He trusted even less. Every attempt to reach him felt like knocking softly against a door that refused to open, no matter how many keys they tried. And then, 2 days ago, the dog arrived. The German Shepherd walked across the open field as though summoned, his large frame steady despite the wear of long miles behind him. He came not with excitement, but with quiet purpose, stopping near the barn and lowering himself gently to the ground, as though this was where the road was always meant to end. Jake noticed him first. The boy had been standing at the edge of the barn, hands in his pockets, eyes cautious but drawn, as though the animal's stillness called to something buried deep inside him. David and Laura watched, holding their breath as Jake, for the first time since coming into their lives, took slow, deliberate steps towards something unfamiliar. The boy knelt beside the shepherd, one hand reaching forward, hesitating just inches from the dog's thick, weathered coat before finally resting gently upon it. The shepherd did not move, did not flinch, but closed his eyes, breathing softly beneath the boy's touch as if this was exactly where he belonged. For hours, they stayed like that, boy and dog, wrapped in the kind of quiet that says more than words ever could. That night, Jake insisted the dog come inside, something he had never requested of any visitor, human or otherwise. David carried the tired shepherd into the house, laying him on a thick blanket beside Jake's bed, where the boy fell asleep for the first time with one hand resting on the dog's side. Laura sat quietly beside David in the hallway, both of them listening to the soft rhythm of breathing coming from behind the door, as if the house itself exhaled with relief. David whispered into the stillness, his voice breaking slightly. "How did he find us, Laura? Out here? After everything?" "Because this is where he was always meant to be," Laura answered softly, her eyes glistening as she watched her son sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. The soft glow of morning had just begun to filter through the thin curtains, casting long, gentle beams across the quiet room where the boy and the dog lay side by side. The house was perfectly still, not with emptiness, but with that rare kind of peace that settles when every piece finally finds its rightful place. Shadow, the old German shepherd, breathed slowly now, his chest rising and falling in smaller, quieter waves, like a tide slowly receding back into the sea. Laura reached over and took David's hand, her fingers tightening just slightly as though steadying herself before speaking words long carried in her heart. "You remember Harold Brooks?" she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to reveal how much weight she had placed behind the question. David nodded slowly. "The teacher. From Montana." "Yes," Laura continued, her voice like warm honey over old scars. "He helped us, long before we ever found Jake. You know that. Harold Brooks had been the one to sit with them late at night when every doctor had said no, when the adoption agencies had pushed them aside, when the paperwork seemed too complicated and hope felt paper thin. He had written the letters, made the calls, pulled strings they didn't even know existed, guiding them patiently through every small door that finally led them to the boy who now slept before them. He was the reason we ever got the chance to adopt," Laura whispered, her voice cracking. "He gave us Jake, David." David's breath caught. The weight of it all finally began to settle into full understanding. "And this dog," he whispered. Laura nodded, tears sliding freely down her cheeks now. This dog was his. Shadow had belonged to Harold Brooks, the man who had quietly, kindly carried the burdens of others, who had touched the lives of Dolores, and George, and Lester, and Allison, and Frank, and Margaret, and Carlos. People who never fully realized they were all stitched together by Harold's unseen hand. When Harold passed, and his family left Shadow behind, no one understood that the old dog carried something far heavier than anyone could see, a memory of every life his master had once touched. One by one, Shadow had walked to each doorstep, not by accident, but by purpose, retracing Harold's unfinished kindness, offering silent company, small healing, and quiet witness where grief still lived. He found them all, every heart Harold once tried to mend, and finally, when all others had been reached, his journey led him here. To Jake. To the boy Harold had once fought so hard to bring into the world. The boy who had waited for love but couldn't find the words to ask for it. The boy who now whispered in his sleep, his fingers still curled gently in the shepherd's fur. "You're mine now, Shadow." And at those words, Shadow exhaled deeply, as though releasing the very last thread he had carried for so long. His eyes closed slowly, not in pain, not in fear, but in peace, the kind of peace that comes only when a promise has been fully kept. The room fell still, and though Shadow's breathing ceased, what filled the space was not sorrow, but a warmth, quiet, steady, like the last soft stroke of a story finished exactly as it was always meant to end. Because sometimes, you see, love doesn't vanish when the ones we love leave. Sometimes, it simply finds a new road to walk, until every broken piece is made whole again. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.